Welcome back to How Not to Play Like Wil Wheaton. This week we'll be reviewing a dice rolling King of the Hill game, King of Tokyo. In the base version of King of Tokyo, all the monsters are exactly the same, so it really doesn't matter which one you pick. It also means you don't have to lock yourself into a specific strategy before the game starts. In fact, it is probably best to get a read of the table before you decide which strategy to lock into. Also, the number of players makes a great impact on what strategies work best. There are two major strategies we're going to talk about today. There's the aggressive strategy that works better in 2, 3, and 5-player games, and then there's the passive strategy that works better in 4 or more player games. The aggressive strategy focuses on controlling Tokyo City and Tokyo Bay while eliminating all your opponents with the claw attacks. It is most effective in 2, 3, and 5-player games because you have the best chance of surviving an entire round in Tokyo under these conditions, so you can get the 2 free bonus points. With only 1 to 2 people possibly attacking you, all the players would need to focus on attacking to make sure you leave Tokyo immediately. In a 5-person game, there are 3 people outside the city and 2 people inside the city, so really there's not a huge difference between being in or out, so it's better to stay in as long as possible to get those points. This strategy requires you to watch your health very closely, because if an attack takes you down to 6 or less health, it's probably best to leave the city and retreat. Having health any lower than that, and you risk being eliminated, or lose efficiency trying to get yourself back to a safe point. In a 2-player game, this strategy should be used almost exclusively, because it is often the person who stays in Tokyo the longest that ends up winning. In a 3-player game, this strategy works best if you're the aggressor and both your opponents are playing passively. If 2 of your opponents are the aggressors, it is actually better off for you to play passively and rack up points while they duke it out. Now, if one of your opponents is playing passively and the other is playing aggressively, it puts you in a really tight spot. Either way you play, you're going to give advantage to the person playing the minority. In this case, diplomacy is required. You need to convince one of the players to change their stance. Usually, it is easier to convince the passive person that the aggressor needs to be taken out, while you quietly slip back into the passive role after a turn or 2 of attacks, so the other 2 duke out the fight you started. In a 5-player game is where things start to get different, because now both Tokyo City and Tokyo Bay are opened up. So in addition to keeping track of the previous points, while in Tokyo, you need to try to determine the actions of the other player in Tokyo. Every time someone outside attacks, it hits both the person in Tokyo City and Tokyo Bay, and then both players have to decide whether they're going to hold or retreat. If the other person is going to hold, and his turn is next, it makes little sense to retreat, because you're essentially leaping in front of his attack. You are safer to stay in Tokyo. But if he is going to retreat, and his turn is next, and you are low on health, it is best to also retreat, so you can dodge his attack. With the aggressive strategy, you want to focus on claws and hearts while you're outside of Tokyo. Energy is not super important, but it can be used to pick up some really nice cards that can help you deal more damage and take out your opponents more quickly, as well as buy you defensive cards to protect you while you're in Tokyo. The victory points, however, are pretty much useless and should always be re-rolled. The passive strategy requires you to focus on building up points while staying outside of Tokyo. You want to make sure not to roll claws if at all possible, because a player can always yield, and forcing you to end up in Tokyo. On your first reroll, you want to reroll any ones you get, because they're really not worth it unless you get 4 of them, and at that point you're losing out on a lot of potential energy and health that is also very vital to the strategy. If you get a pair of 3s or 3 2s, you do want to keep those, because those are great help. Now, the only time you will actually choose to roll claws is if you can eliminate a player in Tokyo. Always go for the elimination unless they are drastically behind you in points. And by drastically behind you, I mean 10 points or more behind you. Energy is much more important in this method because sets of 3 are much more difficult to get than just getting as many claws as possible. There are plenty of cards to help you gather points, some where you take damage, some that just give you bonuses for getting points, and some that actually give you points as well as heal you. You definitely want to pick up a couple of these to help you speed up your victory. especially these ones that are big points for and take damage. They're great for getting your final points that you need to win. Defensive cards are also good to pick up, because once you get high on points, the other players will try to focus and kill you if they can. Absolutely stay away from the attack cards. In fact, if there are really good attack cards out, or expensive cards that you cannot afford, it's actually a better idea to spend energy and cycle them out of play than leave them for someone else to pick up. Well, that's all for this episode of How Not to Play Like Wil Wheaton. I want to hear who your favorite monster is in the comment section below. Please remember to share, like, and subscribe, and as always, remember to stay geeky.